uh, that would be great. Happy for you to turn on your cameras if you would like to as well. But yeah, thank you for joining. We're just waiting for a few more people to join and then we'll get things going. Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on information security. My name is Nicole Chesworth. I am one of the certified information security managers here at Bytes, and function as a cybersecurity consultant within our technical pre-sales team. I've been with Bytes about 5 years now, and yeah, for my sins, it's still going very well. But what we'd like to talk through today is how to build an effective information security program, where to start, and what is involved. So to kick things off, in terms of making security your priority, you would tend to focus on 4 key domains. So all of these features and functions would fit within at least these 4 security domains. One of them being information security governance, information security risk management, information security program development and management, as well as incident management and response. And what I'm going to do today is go through each of these elements, what it means to be able to fulfill these 4 elements and what is involved in that. So in doing my certified information security management program with ISACA, I've tried to consolidate all of my learnings over the last few years, as well as what we learned through the program, and to try and get that into, I think, four or 5 slides. So they'll be quite busy, but hopefully this gives you an awareness of what's involved in rolling this out. So to kick things off, let's start with information security governance. So this is usually broken down into 3 key areas. So where are we today? Where are we going? How will we get there? And how will we know when we have arrived, right? So where are we today is the strategy objectives. And importantly, with the strategy objectives is integrating your business objectives with cybersecurity. What is the business trying to do, and where does cybersecurity fit into that? And naturally, all of these things assume you've got board level sponsorship, top leadership sponsorship with these cybersecurity objectives. And you have somebody in the boardroom who owns the cybersecurity program who can help sponsor rolling this out to the rest of the business. Sometimes we hear, that maybe cyber isn't really a business objective, but I would heavily dispute that and say if cyber fails, is the business disrupted? Probably, and definitely, yes, the business is disrupted. So cybersecurity is definitely a business objective and should be integrated into the business objectives as well as the strategy for the wider business going forward. So you'll find a lot of customers and in different maturity levels, but some of the most mature customers will have cybersecurity integrated into the culture and into people's behaviors. They go as far as integrating cyber into job descriptions and into KPIs and even bonus structures with the most mature out there. So it's important to include those objectives and integrate them with the business, but as well as the culture itself and creating that culture. Now, when you're building out your strategy objectives, you're usually going to rely on a few things. So potentially there's legal requirements involved that you need to meet, maybe regulatory requirements for the specific sectors you're in, and possibly contractual requirements with your customers or with your suppliers. And you would use all of that information to build those strategy objectives. Following that, you would move into the actual development of that strategy. So what needs to be included in there, what's involved? And you would identify the roles and responsibilities of everybody involved, create that roadmap, and identify not just the technical resources, but the human resources, maybe outside resources that are required to be able to fulfill the strategic roadmap. And when you're building out the strategy development plan, you would hopefully have in your mind a desired state. So what you're trying to get to. And there's a few ways you can define a desired state. So these could be standards, for example, using COBIT as a model, or using the BMIS, which is the business model for information security, or using governance, risk, and compliance as a desired state of where you would like to get to. Sometimes that could be frameworks and standards that help you build out that strategy development. So maybe for your specific sector, there's a framework that you need to follow, or there's a particular standard like ISO 27001 or PCI DSS. And all of these can help integrate into your strategy development to build it out. And once you've got that, you can start to move on to, how will we get there, and how will we know when we've gotten there? And the best way is, to define those key metrics, those KPIs or key goal indicators, critical success factors, if you'd like to call them that, on what it will mean when we've gotten there. What will the workforce look like? What is needed to get to the workforce into that position to help us get there, for example. Using audits to be able to measure where you are and to identify whether that gap has been closed, for example. There's a few ways you can start to look at what that strategy implementation would look like and how you get there. But importantly, I think, is the metrics element, to make sure you're keeping yourself honest along the way, but also making sure that you know when you've gotten to the goal and you can now move on to the next element. So that is information security governance, and where you would start in this program development. Once you have that, you're hopefully in a place where you can look at risk management. So sometimes there isn't a risk register involved, but if there isn't one, that's a good place to start, is to understand not just the IT risks, but what are the risks across the organization? Where is the register? Who owns the risks across the different divisions or across the different teams? Identifying that as a start, enables you to go through the risk management process quite succinctly and quite well. So in building out that risk register, you also have to really keenly understand the risk appetite of the business, because for some companies, there's absolutely, they cannot take any risks. I'll use an example of, I'm on a degree program with a few people from nuclear. And in this program, they explain exactly how much risk they can afford to take and how much they can't. For example, safety is super important to them, right? It makes sense because they're nuclear. So they won't tolerate people walking down the stairs without holding the handrail. Because if you're not taking safety seriously for yourself by holding the handrail, are you not taking safety seriously in other areas? And, that could lead to obviously a meltdown, which is quite a drastic option. But they have a very, very strict risk appetite, a very closed risk appetite, and they absolutely don't want to take any at all, even with individuals walking down the stairs. Where for you, it might be quite different, and you are happy with having a few solutions not in place or having a few controls not in place. But yeah, that risk appetite is quite important. What's the point at which the business says, no, this is too much, it's going to cost us, the business itself, it's going to cost us too much money, understanding what that level is. And in building out that risk management framework, there's quite a few things involved. I mean, getting that risk register as a start, and the raising awareness around that risk appetite, what the risks are in the organization, who's owning them, and getting that understanding will then give you a better position to start doing assessments on risk. So when we say emerging risk, this might not necessarily be IT related, but security related risk, nowadays, climate change risks, if you're in places susceptible to floods and things like that. So physical and natural risks, and obviously wars now as well around the world. So there's a number of different risks and emerging threats, so to speak, that you could be evaluating to understand where you sit today. Vulnerabilities from the security world are probably the biggest place you would focus on security in particular, because vulnerabilities within your environment are going to be what's exploited. They're going to be those missing patches, or ports not closed, for example. So being able to assess vulnerabilities, which I know can be quite difficult, especially when there's thousands out there, but hopefully there's a way to prioritize within the vulnerability solutions that are in there, so you can focus on the most exploitable ones, the most impactful ones, for example, and that will form part of your risk analysis. So in evaluating your risks and in your vulnerabilities, there needs to be a way for them to be structured into how likely are these things actually going to happen, because you then want to focus on things that are highly likely and highly impactful, right? That are going to cause the maximum amount of damage. Low likelihood and high impact, maybe, lower down on the priority list. But in terms of managing them, ideally, we want to focus on what's going to have a high impact and what's going to be highly likely. You'd be looking at how frequent these incidents are happening. So nowadays, you might find you're getting more and more ransomware type incidents, or you're getting more and more password failure type incidents. So looking at the frequency of incidents as well should help fill in that risk analysis piece, so you understand what you need to prioritize and rank them in order. And this will include not just on the vulnerability side, but the ranking will be across all of the other risks across the business, so that you can figure out where to focus and align your resources. And once that risk analysis is complete, you're then going into the risk response, right? So deciding what we're willing to accept based on our risk appetite. So you'd have a list of those risks. Maybe you're in a place where, for example, there are climate changes, your offices are now in a flood zone, for example. So maybe that's a risk that's going to go higher up the ladder, but you're going to be like, can we realistically do anything like building flood barriers, or are we going to insure and get the right insurance for this? Because that might make sense based on the likelihood, based on what the impact would be, and also you're always thinking about the cost, right, of what will make financial sense to be able to manage some of these risks. So in that treatment of these risks, breaking them down into how we will respond, what we will do to respond, how we will report on these risks across the business and what's going on with them, and what standards we'll use to manage some of these risks. So there's a number of risk management standards that are out there, potentially that would make sense for different sectors, but then also then deciding how we're going to put the controls in place. What are the mitigating controls that we'll put in place? And we'll touch on this in a bit. So that's information security risk management in those 4 categories, and hopefully you're moving along the process from risk management all the way to how you're going to respond. Now, in building out an information program, there's quite a few elements that you would need to be thinking about and covering with developing a program. Naturally, you're going to base your program on something like a standard, like ISO 27001 or like PCI. Maybe it will be something like Cyber Essentials. There are a number of different standards that you can work with. But that governance piece around deciding the standards and the frameworks that you're going to use is quite fundamental. And it's not just around the technical elements, but the human elements of managing a program. So I'm sure we'll all have some kind of policies and procedures in place. unacceptable IT use, nowadays unacceptable AI use, hopefully. So you would have those guidelines of how devices should be set up. You would have guidelines of how secure devices should be, hopefully. And you'll be using a number of elements like enterprise architecture frameworks or the software development lifecycle. And you'd be incorporating the different divisions like IT operations, like developer operations into your government's framework, and incorporating everybody to be able to be on the same page really around where cyber fits into each of these different areas. In building the program itself, you know, there's got to be a number of program resources, and it's not in an ideal world, you know, you would have all the resources available to you, right? For some customers, it's the IT manager who's managing the information security program, which is quite a lot to take on because of just doing your IT role. InfoSec is a whole other role, and sometimes even multiple roles. So it's quite a lot to take on. But in building the program, there has to be a clean understanding on who the resources are to help support this program. And this is not just on the levels of steering committees. Remember, we mentioned that board sponsorship coming down, but also as individuals, what is our role in this plan? Who is doing risk management? Who is doing our governance and standards? Who is doing data ownership and data management? And breaking that down into what that means for you as an organization. Deciding whether or not you want to use external services and relationships, that's something you have to balance depending on the number of resources you have. Does it make more sense to outsource potentially? Building out security awareness training, probably one of the most fundamental things in changing the culture and improving the cyber culture is that awareness training for each of the end users. So that's absolutely critical in being able to formulate that program, right? It's got to include security awareness training. And again, metrics, like how do we know we're doing well? What are we not doing well? What do we need to change? So all of these areas will form part of what the program is within your environment. And in understanding all of, you know, the assets, now I left that out, but asset identification is absolutely critical, as well as the resources. Like you can't secure assets that you don't know you have. So that strategy has got to incorporate a way to be able to identify assets and manage and control assets as well. And when you have this broad level picture, including your roles and responsibilities, including your suppliers, resellers, your training program, you're hopefully in a space where you can start to do that identification and implementation of the controls to mitigate some of those risks you would have discovered. So when we say technical controls, when you've identified a particular risk, maybe it was after a vulnerability scan, or maybe it was identified by an end user, you could then decide you want to mitigate that risk with a technical solution. So a solution that will prevent an incident or detect on incidents, that will deter incidents, for example. You'd use a number of technical controls and solutions to be able to do that. But sometimes controls are not necessarily a technology. Sometimes they are administrative, as we call them. So they're things like policies and procedures that every user has to sign up and agree to be able to control their behavior or control how exactly they're managing data, for example. So sometimes it's standards with technology, and naturally there can be physical controls like making sure there's locks on the door. So there's a number of different controls you would implement to support your risk management process. And once you've identified those controls, you want to move into that design and implementation. And a fundamental part of implementing, for example, let's call it a firewall solution, to secure your perimeter, you've got to have a good baseline. You have to understand what the best practices, what's the baseline for a secure implementation. And then you're monitoring against that baseline. You're hopefully using things like least privilege or zero trust, as we call it, always verify, don't trust any sort of authentication, but always verify, assume you're in a breach, is what that principle mainly involves. But it's that constant evaluation and checking that your controls are doing the job that they're supposed to do. And logging all of this information to secure that data as well. So the control design and implementation, I think fundamentally has to be based on best practices. And the reason, that we have baselines in there is because you need to be able to understand when something is now an anomaly, when something is not behaving as it usually is, because that could be a threat actor. So baselining across your different controls or technical solutions is quite important so that you're able to detect when something isn't normal and so that you can respond to that. And when you've implemented these solutions, whether these are technical solutions, you've got to be able to test them as well. So as part of control testing, hopefully you're doing penetration tests internally within your network and externally at your network, or any web applications, websites you're hosting, that you're testing all of these elements. And in testing them, you might find that you need to do some other things to make sure you secure your website. So for example, usually when you get a pen test report, it will show different things that are open, some more important than others, or some places where the test was able to succeed at getting to a website and manipulating a website. And hopefully in getting that information and that awareness of what exactly is wrong or what exactly is missing, you're able to identify new measures that you can put in place. And hopefully this then falls into your strategy, falls into the plan. And it's a constant cycle of evaluating yourself and implementing controls, managing the risk, and going through that. It's a continuous process of doing that. But program development as a whole will certainly be covering all of these elements as you build it out. Going into incident management and response as kind of the final section, I think the first three, incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, you'll see on all of them, you've got to have an integration between the three. And why we say that, I'll use an example of a story I heard recently from an ambulance service. So the ambulance service, they have these little tablets where when they pick you up from an emergency, they'll fill in like your name, your age, all of these little details onto these little tablets. And what happened was they had a ransomware attack and they couldn't use those tablets. So they had an incident, right? In their incident response plans, for them to be able to continue doing business, to continue being paramedics and picking up people in emergencies, they decided we'll go to paper. So the business is going to continue by us going to paper. And when we pick up somebody, we'll write down all of their details on paper. And eventually these paper records will will then be, digitized in some way. So in that process, they decided, yes, when we have an incident, we're going to write things down on paper. And while we recover from the disaster, that's the plan. That's what we're going to do. And then we'll go and digitize. Now, the thing was, they didn't realize that 18 months later, they would still be capturing all of the details on these different paper documents, because as part of the plan, they didn't test how well that would work. So they did recover from the disaster. They managed to get the little tablets, wiped, and they set them up again. And they were able to continue with business by using paper. They responded to the incident really, really quickly, but they didn't test and practice this to see how well it would actually work. And there's still big storerooms of paper documents that haven't been captured because of that testing element. So that's why I'd say incident response, business continuity, and disaster recovery all absolutely need to integrate so that you're managing from that incident happening to recovering the business and helping the business continue to work. So I'd say that, but I think that integration is really, really important. And there'll be a number of elements that you incorporate into these plans. So the ambulance example is one example. However, sometimes it might just be about the continuity of network services or high availability of different devices, making sure you have two firewalls in case one firewall dies so that the business continues, or making sure you have server redundancy across different data centers so that the business continues. Sometimes that may be about backups, so that if your backups are in a separate location, something happens to that location, you at least can recover from another place. So there's a number of different elements you would incorporate into business continuity. Sometimes, like you say, the cost might be too much, so insurance makes more sense for that aspect. But overall, the three of them together would be the ideal in terms of integrating and testing them as well. Testing is probably the most important thing around that. In terms of the last three, and in terms of incident management, I think we're still seeing customers have challenges with managing incidents. Even if you have the basic monitoring of logs, for example, there's a lot of incidents that are raised that can cause overwhelm. And sometimes that incident management practice, so to speak, is too difficult to manage. You can't scale to manage it. Not everybody has analysts internally to be able to do this, or different levels of analysts from level 1 to level 3, as an example. So you'd have to be thinking about how you can respond to these incidents when they happen. And if you're not able to do it in a timely manner, to start thinking about whether you need somebody else to help do that. So that might be the case of a managed service, for example, who will constantly be evaluating your environment. And if there is an incident, will let you know or help you respond to that incident, to support your current resources and your current staff with doing that. But managed services are certainly, quite a few customers are starting to look at that more as the number of incidents increase. And I think, unfortunately or fortunately, probably more unfortunately, the number of incidents they're always going to be on the increase as threat actors evolve. As attacks get better, people using Gen AI to create better phishing emails that are not detectable. The scale of these things is going to increase, and it's not going to get easier for security analysts to manage this, or even IT managers who have the responsibility of looking at this at the moment. So considering managed services is probably an important part, or is an important consideration, and what tools and technologies they can use to help you manage the incident life cycle, so to speak. But finally, when you've gone through the process of doing incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, you're now in a place where you can do audits. And hopefully you already have audits ongoing. Normally audits are great to show you what's working well, what's not working well. They'll be based on a number of different frameworks, like the International Organization for Standardization. So that ISO 27001 is a common one for that, or Information Security Forum, sometimes National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, or payment card interest. There's a number of different audits out there that are happening and can be done. But these audits will fall part of understanding what's working well, what's not working so well, helping you benchmark against other companies in the same vertical potentially, or in the same space. And hopefully these audits are happening internally, but also with external eyes as well, to give that, I guess, contextual and what's the word I'm looking for? But yeah, basically to get an external eyes on it, just to give you a better understanding of what's happening in your environment. And once you run these audits, they hopefully fulfill or show you what you should be putting into your strategy for the next few years. And I think it's quite cyclical, the information security program, I would say. Managing all of these elements, they tend to feed into each other and drive one another. But certainly it's quite a lot that's involved there. And I'm conscious that these slides are quite busy as well. But hopefully that makes sense in terms of what's involved in building out a program. And finally, when you look at it at a high level, hopefully your path is going along these lines, right? So it's going from strategy objectives where we started through to risk analysis and risk response. You're doing the program development, identifying the things, the controls that you're going to use, whether they're technical or administrative. You'll be testing those controls as well to make sure they're doing the job that you paid for them to do. But then also overall managing incidents, incorporating these three together. So business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response together, integrating them so that they make sense across the cycle. And then hopefully you're doing incident management. If you're doing this yourselves, great, but maybe that needs managed services. And ultimately you get to a point where you have your audit and it fulfills those, it gives you an awareness of what's working well and what isn't working well. And that audit response will drive the next level of strategy objectives and go through that. I think because of the challenge of this, it's quite a lot involved in making sure you have a program. But I would say in terms of managing it all, if you don't take anything away from this today, is that you don't have to figure it out yourself. You absolutely can speak to us wherever you are on this path, and we have different ways of helping, whether that's with technologies, whether that's with services, whether that's with consulting. Absolutely reach out and speak to us wherever you are on this path. I'm also conscious there was a lot in there, but yeah, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. I think that is the last slide. Are there any thoughts and questions from anyone? Have a quick look at the chat, see if there's anything there. Hi, Jetin. Happy for the slides to be made available. I'll get marketing to make sure those are sent out, but I'm happy to share them with you as well if you'd like to use the slides. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully that was useful in some way, shape, or form. And chat to you soon. Take care all. Bye.